Good morning, church. Pastor Wood here. I wanted to share with you that's something that's hot off the spiritual press. It was impressed upon us this morning in our team prayer meeting, and I want to share it with you real quick. We're in the Bible reading plan right now, if you're following with us, and we're in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 15 to be exact. And in this chapter, it talks about Saul being given an instruction to go in and strike Amalek and devote destruction to all that they have. Basically, he said, go in there, but take nothing away with you. You must not touch anything. It needs to be destroyed. So he was given a very clear instruction. The long and short of the story is that Saul thinks better of himself and says, you know what? I'm going to spare the king, and I'm going to spare the best of the sheep and the oxen and all the fattened calves. Anything basically that was good, he would not utterly destroy. He felt that he could probably do something better with it. So he was obeying, but he was only partially obeying. And what I want to ask you today is, are there things in your life that you're thinking to yourself, you're kind of fooling yourself and almost making an excuse that I am obeying God, but I kind of know better and I'm going to save this, I'm going to do that later, I'm going to delay that obedience. God said to completely stop this thing or to change that or to lay something down, and you're still kind of holding on to it. I want to ask you the question, are you in danger of being like Saul? Because basically the story goes that God actually says to Samuel, for Saul to hear, saying, I regret making you king, for you've turned back from following me. And so what ends up happening is that Saul builds a monument for himself. You see, the very thing of disobedience leads to idolatry. Are there things in your life that have become an idol that basically means that it's above God, that you've decided that this is more important than following God completely? Delaying your obedience is still disobedience. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Much like with our children, in my home, if I ask my kids, clean the kitchen or clean your room, and they do it partially, well, then I'll say, well, you haven't really obeyed. But in their minds, well, I've kind of done it, and that's how we can treat God's instructions and commandments to us. What happens is that Saul is visited by Samuel, and he says, hey, I've performed the good deeds. He covers it up. And then Samuel goes, what? I hear the goats and the oxen bleating in the background. You see, our secret sins will eventually be brought into the light and will make a sound. You think you can fool yourself to thinking, you know what? I'm going to delay obeying what God has said. I know my conscience was awakened, but I'll do that later. Unyat na lang, like here in the Philippines, later lang, later. But you see, God is saying he wants complete obedience. And so Samuel reiterates to him what God is saying. He says, obedience, in verse 22, he says, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Let us not be in the danger of converting our acts of holiness as though we are obeying God. Our good deeds, our service unto the Lord, turning that, because what he did is he kept some of these things back for himself and then thought, I'm going to turn this into a holy matter. I'm going to turn this into an unholy act. Sorry, my phone just fell down in the car. I'm going to turn this into something that will become holy. You see, that which is disobedience will never become holy completely. Right? We need to come back and confess to the Lord and start anew. And that's what I want to encourage you today. But perhaps there is a fear in your heart. Just like Samuel, when he confessed in verse 24, I have transgressed the commandments of the Lord. I didn't obey it because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Whose voice are you fearing and obeying today? Are you putting man, the fear of man, above the fear of God? Don't allow the fear of man to become more than your holy fear of God. You see, God is calling us to holiness. God is calling us to obedience, right? So don't try to convert that sinful act into a place of worship and pretend it's okay. So often we make ungodly choices, or we don't fully obey what God has told us and we know it, then try to fit God into that circumstance. You see, I want to encourage you not to delay. So I want to encourage you to practice immediate obedience. Secondly, obey completely, not partially. What has God called you to do today? Perhaps you're in a place of instability because of this very fact that you're living in partial or delayed obedience. God wants us to follow through in his commandments so that what? We could live with with life and joy and prosperity. In John 15, verse 10 and 11, Jesus commands us to be careful. Today, be careful how you live. Be careful the choices you make. Be careful how you make decisions, bearing in mind if God has said something, are you obeying it completely? He said, be careful, walk in obedience so you may live and prosper. You don't live and prosper by not obeying God. You live and prosper. Obedience opens the pathway to blessing. Today, church, I want to encourage you, do not delay what the Lord has said. I want to encourage you that regardless of the circumstance, how big it looks, if you live in complete obedience, the Lord will fight your battle. The Lord will make the way where there seems like there's no other way. But when we live in partial obedience or delayed obedience, we're in essence shutting ourselves out of God's perfect plan and will in our lives. So is there anything in your life you need to confess today? Perhaps you've turned the act of doing things unto the Lord as your walk rather than being in complete obedience before the Lord. Church, I want to encourage you that God has got a plan that will blow your mind, that's above and beyond your wildest dreams or expectations. Today, if you're facing a mountain, God says, obey me completely. Do exactly as I've said, and then watch me do the work. Complete the work that I have started in you. That's what God says. That's what He promises. Hold on firm and be found in complete submission and obedience to God's will and word over your life. Do not ignore the conscience that He's given you. Do not make it dull today, church. God will make a way when we live in complete and total obedience. What has God said? Go and do it. God bless you, church. I'll speak to you soon.